And just on my mind, the concepts of atheism versus theistic modes of thinking, and how when I was younger, it didn't occur to me that, well, I would have found it silly to think that there could be some kind of reversal in trend away from atheism to more of a spiritual mindset. If someone had suggested to me that the future would be one in which people became more spiritual rather than less so collectively, I would have thought that they were hilariously mistaken, because at that time I regarded religious thought to be an indication of lower intelligence. I realize that was arrogant now and completely solipsistic, pretty much. The notion that we can confidently say there is no higher power is almost like a denial of the weirdness of the universe and of all of the unknown factors within our realm of knowledge, collectively speaking. So on that note, more and more lately I come across the term former atheist, and I know several of my friends and just people that I am aware of classify as such, as former atheists, myself included. This, and I could be in a bit of a bubble here, but this seems to be somewhat of a trend, a wider trend, and it may just be that we're the first real generation, my generation that is, to live out atheism, which means my parents, whether or not they had a firm belief in God, had to do things like go to church, with their parents. And their parents would have been even more ingrained into the cultural groupthink of, say, Christianity, for example, Protestant or Catholic or whatever it might have been. But we're the first real generation to not only identify as atheist, but not to pay any lip service whatsoever. And I mean, there's exceptions, of course, to this analysis. But generally speaking, I do believe it's accurate to say that we're the first real generation in mass to neglect any kind of religious behavior or ideation, and therefore, not go to church and opt out, not to identify as such, or to put any kind of pretense toward that. So therefore, the concept of atheism, I think, experientially affects us differently than previous generations. Now, it could be that the feeling of being oppressed by one's religion or by one's religious mandates made the idea of atheism attractive, but just the idea of it, not the actual practice of it. It's almost like when you're in love with the idea of being in love, so you end up hooking up with people who aren't compatible with you simply because it's the ideal that you're pursuing, and you're kind of looking past or looking over discrepancies or complications. And so being in love with the idea, or rather being attracted to the idea of atheism, makes sense when you have only the intellectual conception of what that might be like compared to, your perceived oppression. So us being the first generation to act out atheism in large degree, we're getting to taste what life is like when there is no God. No pretense, no lip service, just, a general consensus and a general acting out of the premise of godlessness. And that has been, I think, a negative experience in large part for most people. And if you look at and I talked about this in one of my previous videos, but if you look at the mental health crisis I think that's a direct result of a complete lack of spiritual fulfillment. Because if you think of human health, I think we should think of it in a holistic manner, and one of the aspects of that holistic health would be your spiritual health. And the spiritual health of our society is basically non-existent at this point because of, like I said, our acting out of these atheistic ideas. So more and more, as people flounder for satisfaction, or rather for relief from these psychological issues, I think that maybe even begrudgingly, atheists are opening their mind to more possibilities, more potentialities. And what they find in doing so, at least personally and in the experience of some of my friends, is that life becomes more worth living, in the most general way of putting it. And in the more esoteric term, or in a more sort of, lofty term, let's say, magical. It brings magic into being, and being itself becomes more bearable, with all of its attendant sufferings and misery that tend to crop up, even, out of the blue, or at the most unexpected times. It can take a high cresting peak and, bring you completely subterranean pretty quickly, bring you down into the mud. But anyway, a spiritual foundation helps to stay above the bullshit when it strikes. And so, after living out atheism, theistic thought becomes more attractive if you get to the ultimate realization that it's the lack of any semblance of that's a main contributing factor to the listlessness, the unsatisfactory sensation of being is satisfied through the opening of yourself to theistic thoughts. And it's no coincidence that it's part of the healing process in teachings like Alcoholics Anonymous. And also perhaps no coincidence that to be, say, like a member of the Freemason Society, you have to also either believe in or be open to the existence of a higher power. One other thing I'd like to touch on, just since we're on the topic of God and theism, is when intellectually debating in one's mind the notion of God, a lot of people have this preconceived notion of a man in the sky, and you've got to believe X, Y, and Z, and if you don't, then there is no God. No. What I'd like to say is that's not how it works, and I think I touched on this before, so at the risk of repeating myself, don't limit your notion of God to presuppositions prescribed by organized traditional systems. And I use the word traditional loosely because these organized systems are very liberal in their dictates, in what they change and what they consider malleable, is far too wide-reaching, to the point where these aren't divinely ordained commandments, and they're more, the fancy of the latest man in power of that system, and the man at the head of that system. So again, don't think of a man in the sky, don't think of, any one particular descriptive notion of God. Rather, open up your mind to what would be called in ancient Roman terminology a noumena, or a invisible force acting behind and underneath tangible reality that has a active relationship with the unfolding of being. And in the most general sense, that's what God is, and from there you can develop your own personal relationship with these invisible forces, and whatever that ends up meaning to you through your own exploration is going to be far more helpful than anything that you can be, like I said in my previous video, spoon-fed by any official doctrine, any practitioner of any official doctrine, that is. So anyway, coming up on about the 11-minute mark, which seems to be my sweet spot lately in terms of these videos, so I'll end it there. We'll consider this one to be on the topic of theism versus atheism and my thoughts therein. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. I know this one's a little late. Sometimes time goes by and nothing's really striking me as, you know, real heavy hitting or like that I need to spit out to get off my chest. But I made some time for this one. Just started kind of spitballing and the rest came to be. Hopefully this isn't too much like my previous video, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for sticking with me. I'll be back soon. God bless you. Have a great day. And Happy New Year. I know that's not for a day or two, but I probably won't see you until next year. Later.